Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I am Melissa Raid, Chief Sustainability Officer at Sustain.Life, and welcome to the Week in Sustainability. I am joined here today by two of our practitioners. Nick, Constance, please introduce yourself to our viewers.
I'm Nick Lusantag, Senior Manager for Sustainability.
And I'm Constance Duke, Director of Sustainability.
All right, awesome. Well, we are coming to you this week with a fresh look, a new way of doing this. Rather than go into a deep discussion on these topics, we are going to give you highlights of the top sustainability stories happening this week, and we're going to try to do it in 5 minutes. So, what do we want to talk to you about today? Recent election results in Brazil, some key topics that are on ballots in New York and California on state legislatures. A little bit of bad news on the US mega droughts and how that's impacting long-term land and ecosystem impacts in the US, but tying it out with a new reality of what climate and climate impact is going to look like. Best of times, worst of times, looks like we might be somewhere in between. So let's kick it off. Constance, tell us about the election results in Brazil. Lula has won. This is a big victory for climate activists. What does this mean? What does this look like for Brazil? And what can we expect out of that country moving forward?
Yes, the election results came in. It was pretty narrow, but Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, known as Lula, beat Jair Bolsonaro in this election. And Lula has led the country before 2003 to 2011. It was very popular. Deforestation of the Amazon fell by 70% while he was in office without harming the economy, which I think is the important part, is that he somehow managed to decouple the two. And so after Jair Bolsonaro took office, deforestation was at a 15-year high. Scientists feared that it was reaching a tipping point. And of course, that land was mostly cleared for beef and soy production. So this is really exciting news for the climate, because we do expect for Lula, as a climate and environmental activist, to enact policies that will continue to reduce deforestation in the area. Um, and yeah, so it's just a really exciting outcome for the
That
Amazon forest in particular.
Well, as we all know, a win for the Amazon is a literal win for planet Earth. So huge news out of Brazil that, frankly, we all benefit from, which is not often the case with local elections. Okay, awesome. Let's bring it back to the US. What is going on in New York and California with some of the key topics on the state ballots?
Yeah, so speaking of elections here in New York, we're going to be voting in the upcoming election on one particular ballot initiative, which is the it's an environmental bond act, which New York has had many of. The original Environmental Bond Act actually is what established many of the state's parks in the early 20th century. So the state sells these green bonds and the money goes towards statewide initiatives. So this is initially an act that was going to come out during the Cuomo administration and was put on hold during the pandemic, and now it's making a comeback. So the state will sell bonds to fund projects in four areas. About $1 billion of bonds will go towards habitat restoration and flood risk mitigation. A little over $500 million worth of bonds will go towards land conservation. $1.5 billion will go towards climate change mitigation, like EV adoption, mitigating urban heat island effect, and then another 650 million will go towards water quality improvements. So it's a lot of money. It's about $4 billion total. 35% of those funds will have to be spent in disadvantaged communities, which is great. And importantly, it's expected to create 84,000 jobs. So we don't know the results yet, but the thinking is that it will probably pass and is pretty heavily favored. Then in California, we have Prop 30, which is actually increasing taxes on people making $2 million or more every year by 1.75%. It's going to generate $4 to $5 billion a year, which is crazy, and um, it's going to be split. I think about like 60% of it is going to go towards EV adoption, or zero emission vehicle adoption, so charging infrastructure, EV rebates. Half of that has to be spent in low income communities. And then the other like 40 to, I think it's 35 to 40% is going to go towards basically hiring wildland firefighters.
Makes
To,
sense.
yeah,
All right, so I'm
help.
seeing some key themes with the environmental justice of part of that money being used for uh,
Mhm.
for certain communities in both New York and California.
Yeah, and the initiative in California also kind of perfectly aligns with the zero emission vehicle mandate that they put in place that we've talked about before on this. So it's kind of putting their money where their mouth is. They set this target and now they want to put some money towards it. Results aren't out yet, but it's also expected to pass.
Awesome. Love to see it. All right. Well, that's almost a little bit of too much good news. So let's ground everybody. Sometimes you got to take the good with the bad. Constance, what is going on with the U.S. mega drought and prolonged impacts on this beautiful country we call the United States?
Yeah, so this is particularly affecting the US Southwest. We are in the worst drought in at least 1,000 years. So I think we've all been hearing about this for several years now. And we just saw the New Scientist did a picture series of the impacts. And it's such an observable effect of climate change to see how our bodies of water are being impacted. The NASA and the USGS have actually been taking satellite images of these developments for more than 50 years, and that allows us to see a time lapse of what is happening. And that is, riverbeds drying up. We have just seen a drastic reduction in snow caps, which of course feed rivers and creeks. And so that's a pretty horrific development. Lakes receding in their beds. And I don't know if you guys remember, but back in 2014, um, the um, the Mexican portion that is fed by the Colorado River got so dry that the Morales Dam had to be opened up just to keep the local flora and fauna alive and not completely destroy that ecosystem. But of course, that water also supplies 40 million people from the Colorado River specifically. So when we're talking about environmental justice, again, this is one issue that keeps coming up. Um, so yeah, there isn't much we can say in terms of, there's action we're taking to reduce this. This is just something that's happening as a result of climate change. I don't think we emphasize enough how important water conservation is, and how much intersectionality there is between climate change, water scarcity, and biodiversity, but they all do play together. And it's something that we probably need to pay more attention to.
Absolutely. I will, even though on this dire story, I will find one silver lining, which is perhaps that because we have these satellite images of the impact on these water sources, we have a visual understanding and representation and time lapse. And that's something that you don't often get with climate change, right? You don't really have a tangible understanding or exposure to the impacts. So we always draw that line back to the hole in the ozone layer where, oh my God, we like knew that there was this hole and we saw these visual pictures of it and everybody could act so fast, governments, policies, people, to really understand that problem and do things to address it. Maybe water can be a little bit of a similar impetus to really, continue to charge the fight in climate change.
Sure.
All right. Speaking of climate, Nick, what is going on with our warming scenarios? We've got some recent articles out, one by the New York Times that is talking about the best of times, the worst of times. None of those are going to happen, but something in between is going to happen. What do you got?
Yeah, so there was a piece last week in the New York Times, really just sort of taking stock of where we are right now with the entire climate movement, including climate modeling. And this kind of ties in with what we've been talking about recently in terms of renewable energy becoming cheaper. And basically, they're talking about how the possible windows of our climate futures is narrowing. And part of that is because it's just becoming more clear what is being done and what will be done. And also because we're just proceeding through climate change and we're getting a clear picture of, the next 10 to 20 to 30 years. And that picture is both good and bad, right? The good part is that we know there's not going to be an apocalypse. We know that it's very, very, very unlikely we're going to see, 5 to 6 to 7 degrees of warming, which is what was talked about, 10 to 20 years ago. Um, the bad news is that we're still going to see warming, and we're still going to see, you know, a lot of unnecessary upheaval, a lot of unnecessary deaths, and it's just it's not okay. But we're in this middle ground, and there's kind of this paradoxical feeling of some relief, but still some terror, frankly. Um, so just to cover some of the numbers there, we've already warmed about 1.1 to 1.2 degrees right now. Um, right now, current modeling is saying we're going to be at about 2.7 by 2100. So somewhere between 2 and 3. And, you know, if we're following the Paris Climate Accord, we want to be well below 2 or at 1.5. So um, it's a lot better, though, than the 4.5 that was projected 10 years ago.
Mm. Yep.
We
And we
we should
spoke.
acknowledge that the 4.5 was a horrific scenario. So you
Yeah.
know, even 2 is still a pretty bad scenario. So not to dampen the optimism here, but yeah, it's still not a great outlook, and action is definitely needed.
Totally. I was going to say the same thing. Like numbers wise, it's like, oh, if we were talking about 7.5%, like, okay, like, you know, 4 doesn't sound so bad, but actually, no, it's still really, really bad. It's just that the entire world won't melt or explode, but there will certainly be real consequential, devastating impacts. All right, folks. Well, that's what we have for you today. We will see you next week for more commentary on sustainability stories. Thanks for joining us.